Hey folks, welcome back to Basic Design. This is day 12. Day 11 was a studio day where students were continuing to work on the project that we introed on day 10, which was called the 5 Modes Project. It follows 4 main modes. To remind you, graphic is a mode of representation that uses a high amount of detail in order to be particular and specific. There's simple, which is a lack of detail in order to be universal and broad. There are gestural ways of representing things so that the gestures express an energy that is not necessarily carried over through either detail or lack of detail necessarily. And then there is radical, which is a stylization that drastically changes and brings in a lot of variety based on the way in which you stylize something. The final mode is introduced today. So students have made various representations of these 4 modes, and I have them break into groups. And there's a couple things I like to emphasize here, which again, if you're tracking the way I do critiques, especially through this basic course, I'm trying to get across to the students that, so let me back up. What they do is they mix up all of their things, they give them to their group members, and the group members have to go through them and parse them out and divide them into what do they think the graphic representations are, the gestural, the simple, the radical, etc. And I had an interesting conversation with a student this morning who said, well, we're trying to get it right. And I was like, no, like stop. Like the point is for the artist to see what they got right. It's not that you're trying to guess what the artist did. It's you guys responding. And especially when we think back to the London Olympics 2012 and the fact that it was largely panned by audiences, it's like they didn't, it was not the audiences who failed to see what the designers made. It was the designers who failed to understand what they were making. They were making a joke and they thought they were making something awesome. So I tell the students, like, no, the group is right, the artist is wrong in this situation. Now, obviously, there are different contexts in which this is not going to be the case in critique. This is not always how I teach, but in a design context in particular, that's one of the things that students need to understand. That's one of the reasons why we have art students taking this class, is to think about the audience. There's so many moments in art making that we don't think about the audience. We don't consider their expressions and their interpretations and all of these different things that come into a piece. A piece is only half of the thing. That's why I talk about context and audience. Together, they make an experience of a visual work of art and any work of art. And so in a design situation, you're trying to think about that and incorporate that. So they do that, and then they choose some of the best ones, and then we start talking about ideal. And this is where I like to, this is the beginning in this course. So like the first part of the course, teaching in an art context, the first part of the course is like heavily designed, because I've got students who like, they just don't know that. So I have to be really strict in that regards. But as the course continues, we're going to stray more towards artistry and exploration, where they're using the tools that are traditionally, even though that doesn't mean much anymore, but the tools that are generally associated with graphic design or the graphic arts. And we're going to be making all kinds of cool exploratory things. So the 5th mode is what I call the ideal. And literally the parameters for this one is when they put up their work, I say, which one's your ideal? And they point at it and I say, is that your favorite? And they say yes. Like, you as an artist, I say this to the students, you as an artist, your parameter there is the one you like the most. It is your ideal. And, we'll have a conversation on the critique day. Why? Why is that your ideal? What do you like about it? What do you see? The other thing that happens with the ideal, so when we're looking at the 4 other categories, the parameters of the sort of the critique will be that there's no confusion, that the class together can go, okay, that's your graphic, that's your simple, that's your gestural, that's your radical. Occasionally I'll interject why, what makes this radical, etc. And I'll go over that when we get to that critique. But that's the goal, is that there's no confusion. And this is a construct, as in most modes of representation are not as clear cut, but I'm trying to inculcate into them an understanding of these 4 different things. Specifically, think about what I'm describing and why these are great categories. Being precise, when should you be precise? Being general, when should you be general? Being energetic, when should you be expressive? And then being bizarre, when should you be bizarre? Those are like modes of representing in any realm. We talk about it this way. I like to talk about Instagram, and I said today to the class, if I'm right, and that this is a great way to think about any kind of visual representation, then these modes are going to be, we're going to be able to see them and see the different strategies playing out regardless of medium. So what is a graphic Instagram account? And it was funny, the student really didn't think about this, but one of the first thing that came up was the student said National Geographic, which has the word graphic in it. And I asked, what do you mean? Like, they have these photos, they've got, animals and details, and they give you some scientific facts and ecological facts and all these things. And so I asked, why would what's the goal of National Geographic? Why would they choose a graphic strategy? And it's like, they're trying to preserve and educate and do all these things. And so they're trying to get detailed, and that's why they're working in that way. And I say, what's a simple account? And the first answer that came up was a meditation account. This account that is trying to give you a moment of solace with all of their reels and posts and whatnot. And it was like, why if what is the goal of that? It's like they're trying to find a moment of solace for you. Why does simple lend itself towards that? Like, there's all kinds of things to unpack there, which is like what art history is about. Art history is the discovery of how these different elements and principles of creativity and design in their various fields generally impact human beings. Why is there always that boom for any kind of meditation? Why is it soothing, simple noises like rivers and whatnot? And we discussed this. We can't make determinations that are based on extremely rigorous studies, but we can have some intuitions towards this. And the intuition is simply this: when you're in a highly detailed environment, especially one that is relatively chaotic, you have to track a lot of things, and it's taxing. Whereas a simple environment, one where there's clear white walls and stuff like that, you don't have to do as much cognitive work tracking your environment. And so simplicity often tends towards, this is a moment where I can relax. This is where I can shut out the things. And that's also why your home might be complicated, but because you recognize it and the things fulfill the pattern and aren't changing, everything's good. But imagine you're home and like you walk in and the chair's upside down and there's a broken frame askew on the wall. You immediately get into that high alert. It's no longer a simple setting that you can generally ignore and relax in. Then we talk about a gestural one, and I had racing channels, dancing accounts, dancing accounts. They're trying to get across the energy, and of course now that Instagram is unfortunately mostly video, that works in the real sense. It's way better in the reels on Instagram reels sense is way better at carrying over the gestural. The other thing I think is like memes. Memes are, by their construction, they're crude and not technically skilled, but they're trying to get across the energy of an experience. And so sometimes it's really subtle things, like a boyfriend looking over his shoulder, or the girlfriend as he checks out another girl. It's like that is a gesture we understand. That's carrying the energy of her emotion and all of that. And then radical, I like to talk about, comedians, things that are stylizing something. So like that's what a comedian is doing. They're generally, not all of them, but I mean, from Rowan Atkinson, which we talked about last week, he's trying to do something in a funny way. Stand-up comedians are doing the same thing. An observation that is generally going to be mundane, stylized in their mode of delivery, etc., will help us see it in a funny light. Other kinds of accounts like this, we talked about a lot of artists. A lot of artists are today in contemporary arts, one of the things they are trying to do is develop a personal voice. Sometimes it's called branding, or it'd be a personal style. Sometimes we call it language, etc. What we're getting at is that thing that is unique to you that no one else does. And so it's your style. And that's what most visual artists are trying to do to some regard, some degree. And so then we talk about, okay, we can see those strategies. We've successfully made ones that align with this, where we're understanding them, we're seeing their strengths. We're seeing their individual strengths. We're understanding contexts in which that would work. We're understanding audiences that would be perceptive to specific strategies. Then we talk about the ideal. So, what's the point of the ideal? One, this is my moment to begin kind of introducing that artistic side of things, so that students who want to be self-expressive can see that this class addresses that. Two, ideals, like the categories, like I said, are constructs. They're there for us to learn, but in reality, these things are happening all the time at once. Even the things I'm talking about, like there are some comedians, like I think Tig Notaro has a set where Tig pushes a stool across the stage, listening to the noise. On one hand, kind of gestural. On one hand, extremely radical, and also simple. It's like you can combine them to get the strengths of the different modes of representation in some ways. So with their insects that they're working with, what if you have a graphic head, a simple body, and radical wings? What do you get from that? Can you get elements of the different strategies to work together into like a chimera? And so they do different collage exercises. We look at the work, and then we get into an exercise of creating more things. And honestly, the class this morning had a lot of fun with it. They like using their bodies. They like collaging and cutting things up and whatnot. There's one other thing that we talk about, and that is we look at the work of artist William Kintridge. He's a South African artist who makes a bunch of interesting drawings, and really you can see that if you look at his work, I'll link 2 videos in particular, that his work is all about how a thing is represented, that the way you represent something drastically changes our perception of it. So the first video is this great video of him titled Making a Horse, where he's trying to play around and make a horse. It starts with his body, he then makes video, and then he shows himself playing with a collage form. And ask yourself, I'll talk about the second video first as well. So in the second video, it's an Art 21 interview with Kintridge, where he talks about the notion of observing these things and how the artist is taking things from outside of themselves and are integrating it in different ways, using it to inspire work, and how this is voyeuristic, appropriative, all of these things, in order to find things that connect with human beings. And he talks about how in looking at these things, there's a tenderness and a love there, even though it might be an absurd thing or a painful thing, because a lot of Kentridge's work is thinking about the racial tensions that have occurred historically and currently all throughout South Africa. And what he is trying to get at is that the artist spends time looking at these things. So when you might wonder why am I assigning the insects and why do we keep using them for these projects, is I'm trying to get the students to understand through the process of doing it, this notion of looking at a thing for a long time, taking time to observe it. And in the first video about making a horse, I think it's very interesting as you watch it, if you think about, when do I lose sight of the horse? How did Kentridge figure out that he could have the most bare bone minimum forms and they will still be interpreted with a horse given the proper context and priming? That kind of searching is how things like great logos, like the Nike swoosh, in case folks, can't remember if I talked about it on this video series, but the Nike swoosh is not a swoosh, it's a wing, because it's named after the god Nike, who had winged feet. And the idea of a sports brand with shoes that, especially I think of the Air Jordans. I haven't watched that movie yet about but anyways, they're trying to get across this notion of wings on your feet, of being able to fly and jump high and run fast. And it's coming from figuring out that you can, in the right context, you can turn a swoosh into a wing. That distilled the wing down to that simple form. And then you see all these people walking around. They don't even realize they have winged feet. That's what happens when you get really popular. And that kind of exploration of form is what this observation, this looking at things can do. So that's like one of the major arcs over the course of this class. I think every art class is about teaching perception and observation. in order that we might see the world around us, be more inspired, and understand how beautiful and detailed it is, and how much better it is than the things we make. Humbling, I suppose, is the right term. All right. Have a good weekend.